There are some debts that cannot be paid with money, and there are some tears that the soil of the earth never forgets. In Igbo land, they say that the ground you spit on today is the same ground you will have to lay your head upon tomorrow. But what happens when the nobody you threw out into a midnight storm returns? Not as the broken girl you despised, but as the woman who holds your very life in her manicured hands. This is the story of a woman who believed her gold-plated gates could keep out the curse of poverty forever. Her name was Lolo Ezinokeke. Scoffs! Lolo Ezin was a woman of high titles, expensive wrappers, and a heart as hard as the marble floors of her mansion. She believed that the blood in her veins was purer than anyone else's, and she protected her family's reputation like a hawk. But there was one stain on her perfect family tree, her daughter-in-law, Kachi. To the neighbors, Kachi was a quiet, brilliant girl with a smile that could heal the sick. But to Ezin, she was just a village girl with no father's name and no dowry worth mentioning. A reminder of a world Ezin wanted to forget. You see, Ezin's son had married Kachi against her wishes, and Ezin was determined to wait for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came one Tuesday at midnight, while her son was away across the ocean, under a sky that was screaming with thunder and pouring down a torrential Lagos rain. Ezin opened the heavy iron gates of the estate. She didn't give Kachi a coat. She didn't give her a kobo. She simply threw a small, soaked bag into the mud and said the words that would ignite a fire. Go back to the gutters where you belong. My son deserves a queen, not a beggar. Kachi stood there, her cheap Ankara cloth clinging to her shivering body. She watched those gates lock with a sound like a guillotine. That night, a young woman learned a truth that changes a person forever. When the world treats you like trash, you either rot or you become gold. Lolo Ezin got exactly what she wanted, a house free of poverty. For years, she reigned over her social circles, dripping in diamonds and mocking those beneath her. She was the definition of arrived. But hidden beneath her pride was a ticking clock, because somewhere in the corridors of the city's most prestigious universities, the girl she discarded was working 3 jobs. At 22, Kachi was cleaning hospital floors to pay for medical books. At 25, she was the top of her surgical class, surviving on 1 meal a day. At 28, she buried the bitterness of the past and replaced it with a cold, unstoppable ambition. Years later, fate would bring Lolo Ezin to a gate she never expected to visit, not as a guest of honor, but as a dying woman gasping for air. She was rushed to the elite St. Grace private hospital, a place where the rich pay for a second chance at life. But as Ezin lay on that stretcher, praying for a miracle, the owner of the hospital stepped out of a luxury black Audi. The clicking of her designer heels on the wet marble sounded just like the ticking of a clock that had finally run out of time. This is the story of the beggar who became the boss. The sky over the Okeke mansion was not just black, it was angry. A heavy midnight rain pounded against the roof like 1,000 hammers, and the wind screamed through the palm trees. Inside the grand living room, the air was cold. Lolo Ezin stood by the gold-trimmed door, her face as hard as a stone. She looked at Kachi, who was shivering in a thin, soaked dress. "Please, Mama," Kachi whispered. Her voice was shaking. "It is midnight. The buses have stopped. Where will I go in this storm?" Ezin did not blink. She adjusted her expensive lace wrapper and looked at Kachi with pure disgust. To Ezin, Kachi was a mistake that needed to be erased. She saw Kachi as a poor girl who had tricked her son into marriage, a girl whose father had died, leaving nothing but debts. "Do not call me Mama," Ezin snapped. Her voice was louder than the thunder. "A lion does not give birth to a goat. My son is away in London, and while he is gone, I am cleaning this house. I am washing away the smell of poverty you brought through my gates." Ezin reached down and grabbed a small, blue nylon bag. It was the only thing Kachi owned. With a sudden, mean jerk, Ezin opened the heavy front door. The rain sprayed into the expensive hallway, but Ezin did not care. She threw the bag out into the mud. "Go back to the gutters," Ezin shouted over the rain. "My son deserves a woman whose name opens doors, not a girl who begs for crumbs." Kachi felt a sharp pain in her chest that was worse than the cold. She looked at the woman she had served for 2 years. She had cooked, cleaned, and massaged Ezen's feet, hoping to be loved. But in Ezen's eyes, Kachi was not a person. She was just baggage. With a rough shove, Ezen pushed Kachi out onto the porch. Kachi stumbled and fell on her knees. The wet marble felt like ice against her skin. Before she could say another word, the massive, iron-studded door slammed shut. The sound of the lock turning felt like a physical blow to Kachi's heart. She was alone. The streetlights were dim, and the rain was so thick she could barely see the road. Kachi crawled to her bag and pulled it out of the puddle. Her dignity was gone, washed away in the Lagos mud. She looked up at the darkened windows of the mansion. At that moment, something inside Kachi changed. The girl who cried and begged stayed on that porch, but a new woman stood up. She wiped the muddy water from her face and squeezed her bag tight. She didn't have a kobo in her pocket, and she didn't know where she would sleep, but she made a silent promise to the dark sky. "You call me a beggar today," Kachi whispered, her teeth chattering. "But one day, you will be the one at the gate. And on that day, I will be the one with the key." She turned away from the mansion and walked into the darkness. Every step was heavy, but she did not look back. Behind her, the Okeke mansion stood tall and proud, but inside its walls, Ezen had just thrown away the only person who truly cared for her life. The rain continued to fall, hiding Kachi's tears as she disappeared into the night. Before that rainy midnight, Kachi had lived a life that felt more like a prison than a marriage. When she first married Ezen's son, she thought she was entering a family. Instead, she had entered a furnace. To Ezen, a daughter-in-law without a wealthy father was not a relative. She was an unpaid servant. Every morning, while the sun was still hiding behind the trees, Kachi's day began. She would scrub the wide marble floors of the mansion until her knees were raw and red. Ezen would walk past her in expensive silk slippers, often dropping her gold jewelry on the wet floor just to watch Kachi scramble to pick it up. "Careful, girl," Ezen would hiss, her voice sharp like a razor. "That necklace costs more than your father's entire village. Don't touch it with those rough hands." Kachi would lower her head, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She did all the cooking, spending hours in the hot kitchen preparing Ezen's favorite pounded yam. But when the food was ready, Kachi was never allowed to sit at the long mahogany dining table. She had to eat in the small, dark pantry, sitting on a wooden stool surrounded by bags of rice and cleaning supplies. One afternoon, a group of Ezen's wealthy friends came over for a tea party. They were dressed in bright lace and heavy beads, laughing about their trips to Dubai and London. Kachi was busy serving them, carrying a heavy silver tray of snacks. Her arms were tired, and her back was aching from a long day of washing heavy curtains. "Ezen, who is this girl?" one of the women asked, looking at Kachi's simple cotton dress. "Is she your new housemaid?" Kachi held her breath, hoping Ezen would finally defend her. She hoped her mother-in-law would say, "No, this is my son's wife." But Ezen only laughed, a cold and mocking sound that echoed through the room. "She's just a nobody my son brought home," Ezen replied, waving her hand as if Kachi were a fly. "She has no name, no money, and no people. I only keep her here because she knows how to scrub a toilet properly." The women laughed, and Kachi felt the tray tremble in her hands. She felt like a shadow in a house full of lights. Whenever her husband was home, Ezen acted differently, but the moment he turned his back, the cruelty returned. Ezen would hide Kachi's letters from her family and tell her that she was a curse to the Okeke name. "You are a beggar," Ezen would whisper when they were alone in the hallway. "You came here with nothing, and you will leave with nothing. Remember that." Kachi did remember. She remembered every insult, every cold meal, and every time she was made to feel like she didn't exist. This was the curse of a nobody, the feeling that because you were born poor, you did not deserve respect. But as Kachi scrubbed the floors and served the tea, she was watching. She was learning how the rich lived, how they talked, and how they built their walls. She was a nobody now, but deep inside, a fire was starting to burn. The rain did not stop. It felt like the clouds were trying to drown the entire city of Lagos. Kachi walked for over an hour, her feet slipping in the thick, brown mud. Her blue nylon bag was heavy and soaked through. Every time a car drove past, splashing dirty water onto her face, she felt a fresh sting of shame. She had gone from a mansion to the gutter in just one night. Finally, she saw the dim, flickering yellow lights of a roadside bus station. It was mostly empty, except for a few tired travelers sleeping on wooden benches. The air smelled of old smoke and wet earth. Kachi found a small corner under a leaking tin roof. She sat on the cold concrete floor and pulled her knees to her chest. She was shivering so hard that her teeth made a clicking sound in the quiet night. She opened her bag to see if anything was dry. Her few clothes were ruined, stained by the muddy water of Ezen's driveway. She reached the bottom of the bag and found her old biology textbook from years ago. The edges were soft and wet, but it was still there. She held the book tight. It was the only proof that she once had a dream of becoming a doctor before she became a nobody in the Okeke house. A woman selling roasted corn nearby looked at Kachi. The woman saw the ruined clothes and the red eyes. She didn't say much, but she handed Kachi a small piece of cardboard to sit on, so she wouldn't be directly on the wet floor. "Thank you," Kachi whispered. Her voice was scratchy and weak. "Don't cry, my daughter," the woman said softly. "The sun always comes back after the rain." Kachi looked out at the dark sky. She looked at the expensive estates in the distance, where the rich lived behind high walls and bright electric lights. She thought about Ezen sleeping in a warm bed with silk sheets. She thought about how the gate had clicked shut, locking her out like she was a piece of trash. A new kind of heat started to grow inside her. It wasn't the heat of anger, but the heat of a promise. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff from the cold. She stepped out just a little bit into the rain and looked up at the black clouds. "You think you have finished me," Kachi said to the wind. Her voice was quiet but very steady. "You think because I have nothing today, I will have nothing forever. But listen to me. This rain is washing away the old Kachi. The one who begged for your love is dead." She squeezed her soaked textbook until her knuckles turned white. "One day, I will own the lights," she vowed. "I will own the buildings. I will own the very air you breathe. And when that day comes, Lolo Ezen, you will be the one standing in the rain, and I will be the one with the power to say yes or no to your life." She sat back down on her piece of cardboard. She didn't have a bed, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had a home inside her own heart. She closed her eyes and began to plan. Then nobody was gone. The doctor was waking up. The next few years were not a dream. They were a battle. Kachi did not go back to her village to cry. Instead, she stayed in the city and worked until her bones ached. During the day, she cleaned the floors of a small clinic, scrubbing away blood and dirt just like she had done at the Okeke mansion. But there was one big difference. This time, she was doing it for herself. At night, while others slept, Kachi sat under the dim streetlights near the bus station. She studied her old, water-stained medical books until her eyes burned. She saved every single kobo. She skipped meals, living on only a small piece of bread and water, just so she could pay for her university entrance exams. When she finally got into medical school, the other students looked at her worn clothes and called her the girl from the streets. Kachi did not care. She knew that a lion does not turn around when a small dog barks. Medical school was a mountain of fire. Kachi had to be the best because she had no one to catch her if she fell. While the wealthy students went to parties, Kachi stayed in the library. She learned how to use a scalpel with hands that were once rough from washing Ezen's clothes. She turned her pain into focus. Every time a professor praised her work, she whispered to herself, "I am becoming the light." But being a doctor was only the start. Kachi realized that to truly own the lights, she needed more than a white coat. She needed power. Between her long shifts at the hospital, she began to study business. She started small, buying medical supplies and selling them to rural clinics that the big companies ignored. She was smart, fast, and honest. Soon, her small business began to grow. She worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. There were times when she was so tired she fell asleep standing up in the hospital hallway. There were times when her bank account was empty and she wanted to give up. But every time she felt weak, she remembered the sound of that iron gate slamming shut at midnight. She remembered the cold mud on her knees. That memory was like fuel for her engine. Slowly, the nobody became a somebody. Kachi stopped wearing tornankara and started wearing sharp, professional suits. She moved from a bus station to a small room, then to a flat, and finally to an office that overlooked the city. She wasn't just Dr. Kachi anymore. She was a medical tycoon. She began to buy small, struggling clinics and turn them into the best hospitals in Nigeria. She was building an empire made of blood, sweat, and iron will. She watched the news and saw that the Okeke family was losing their wealth after many bad choices. She didn't smile, and she didn't celebrate. She simply went back to her desk and signed more papers. Her plan was moving forward, one hospital at a time. The girl who was kicked out in the rain was gone. In her place stood a woman who was ready to own the very ground Ezen walked on. While Kachi was climbing the mountain of success, Lolo Ezen was sliding down into a dark valley. Pride is a dangerous thing. It makes a person think they can never fall. Ezen still walked with her head high, wearing her gold jewelry and expensive lace. But the foundation of the Okeke house was rotting. Without Kachi there to do the hard work and manage the small details, the mansion began to feel heavy. Ezen's son was still away, sending money that was never enough for his mother's expensive tastes. Ezen wanted to show the world she was still the queen of the city. She began to put her money into big business deals that she did not understand. She gave millions to smooth-talking men who promised her she would become a billionaire overnight. She didn't listen to warnings because she thought she was too important to be cheated. But the world does not care about titles. One by one, the investments failed. The gold mines turned out to be empty dirt. The luxury buildings were never built. Ezen began to sell her lands just to pay for her daily tea parties. She sold her cars, replacing them with older models, telling her friends she just wanted something classic. Then came the day the music stopped. The bank sent letters with red ink, but Ezen threw them in the trash. She thought her wealthy friends would save her. She invited them to a grand lunch, hoping to ask for a loan. But as the women sat at her living room, they noticed the dust on the shelves and the way the air conditioner made a dying noise. They saw that the queen was losing her crown. Ezen, one of her oldest friends, said, looking at a small crack in the marble floor, "We heard you lost the property in Abuja. Is it true?" Ezen tried to laugh, but her voice sounded thin and weak. "It is just a small problem. A lion is still a lion, even if it is resting." But her friends were not lions. They were vultures. The moment they realized Ezen had no more power to help them, they stopped calling. They stopped inviting her to their weddings and parties. When Ezen's phone rang, it was only the bank. When she walked into the market, the women who used to bow to her now turned their heads and whispered. The biggest blow came when the mansion itself was taken. Ezen stood on the same porch where she had once pushed Kachi. She watched as strangers carried out her velvet chairs and her gold-trimmed mirrors. She was left with nothing but a few old wrappers and a heart full of bitterness. Her son, broken by his mother's bad choices, could no longer help. Ezen moved into a small, hot room in a crowded part of the city. The woman who once mocked the smell of poverty now lived in the middle of it. She sat by a tiny window, watching the rain, and for the first time, she felt a cold shiver of fear. She was old, she was poor, and she was alone. The nobody she had kicked out was now a shadow that followed her every thought. Ezen had lost her house, her friends, and her pride. All she had left was a cough that would not go away and a memory of a girl in the mud. While Ezen was losing her last few kobo in a dusty room, Kachi was moving like a ghost through the world of big money. She did not want fame yet. She did not want her name on the front of every newspaper. She wanted something much more powerful. She wanted to be the silent architect of a new future. Kachi had her eyes on one specific prize, St. Grace Private Hospital. It was the most famous hospital in the city. It was the place where the richest people went when they were sick. It was a building made of glass and expensive blue lights, with floors so clean you could see your own face in them. For years, The Okeke family had used St. Grace as their private clinic. Ezen used to brag about how the doctors there would bow whenever she walked into the lobby. But behind the beautiful glass walls, St. Grace was in trouble. The owners had spent too much money on fancy machines and not enough on paying their debts. They owed millions to the banks. Kachi sat in her quiet office, looking at the secret financial papers. She saw a chance to finish where she had started on that rainy night years ago. She did not walk into the hospital with a loud voice. Instead, she used her growing wealth to slowly and quietly buy the hospital's debts from the banks. One by one, she gathered the papers that proved she owned the land, the machines, and the very air inside the building. The directors of the hospital didn't even know her real name. They only knew that a powerful company called Kachi Ventures was now their master. "Why are we selling to her?" one of the directors asked during a secret meeting. "We don't even know who she is." "Because she is the only one with the cash to save us," another replied. "And she has a plan for this place that is bigger than anything we ever dreamed." Kachi was not just buying a building. She was building a trap made of success. She hired the best doctors and bought the newest medicine. She made St. Grace the only place in the country that could save a life when hope was almost gone. She knew that pride always leads to a fall, and when a proud person falls, they always look for the best hands to catch them. Every evening, Kachi would drive past the hospital in her black car. She would look at the glowing blue sign and remember the dim yellow lights of the bus station. She remembered sitting on a piece of cardboard, shivering. Now, she was the one who decided who could enter those glass doors and who had to stay outside. She was no longer the girl with the soaked nylon bag. She was the woman who owned the keys to life and death in the city. She waited patiently, like a hunter in the tall grass. She knew that eventually the curse of a nobody would bring Ezen to her doorstep. Kachi was ready. Her hospital was ready. The stage was set for the final meeting, and this time, the rain would not be Kachi's enemy. The heat in the city was heavy, and the air smelled of dust and exhaust fumes. Lolo Ezen walked slowly along the side of the road, her old sandals dragging in the dirt. Her lungs felt like they were filled with hot sand, and every breath was a struggle. She was no longer the woman who wore gold lace and commanded respect. Now, she was just an old woman in a faded wrapper, clutching a small plastic bag of cheap medicine that wasn't working. She reached a crowded bus stop, the very same one where she had once heard people talk about nobody girls. Her legs felt like water. The world began to spin in circles of bright light and deep shadows. The loud honking of the yellow buses sounded like they were miles away. She reached out to grab a wooden pole, but her fingers were too weak. With a soft groan, Ezen collapsed. She fell onto the hard, dirty concrete, her head landing near a puddle of oily water. People crowded around her, their faces blurry and distant. "Someone help this mama!" a young man shouted, but nobody moved. In the big city, everyone was too busy chasing their own lives. Ezen lay there, staring at the gray sky. For a second, her mind traveled back in time. She remembered the midnight rain. She remembered the face of a young girl shivering on a porch. She remembered throwing a blue nylon bag into the mud. It was a strange and cruel joke of fate. The woman who had kicked Kachi out to die at a bus stop was now dying at one herself. The ground she had once looked down upon was now the only thing holding her up. "She's not breathing well," a woman cried out. "Call an ambulance. Take her to St. Grace." St. Grace. Even in her pain, Ezen knew that name. It was the hospital of the kings. It was the only place with the machines that could save her failing heart. But she also knew she had no money. She had no name left. She was the nobody now. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Ezen felt a cold darkness closing in. She was terrified. She didn't want to die in the dirt, surrounded by strangers who didn't know her titles. She wanted to be saved, but she had spent her whole life closing doors on others. Now, she needed a door to open for her. The paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher. Her eyes flickered open one last time before the world went black. She saw the tall glass buildings of the rich part of the city. She saw the glowing blue lights of the hospital she used to brag about. She didn't know that the girl she had thrown away was waiting behind those glass doors. She didn't know that her life was now in the hands of the very person she had tried to destroy. The final breath was coming, but the story was not over yet. The sky turned dark again, and a cold wind began to blow through the city. Just like that night years ago, the rain started to fall in heavy, gray sheets. It washed over the glass walls of St. Grace Private Hospital, making the blue and white lights glow like jewels on the wet ground. Outside the main entrance, a crowd had gathered. A woman in a worn, muddy wrapper was being held up by two nurses. It was Lolo Ezen. She was gasping for air, her face pale and full of fear. "Please," Ezen cried out, her voice cracking. "I can't breathe. You have to help me." The head nurse looked at her with a sad but firm face. "Madam, this is a private hospital. The deposit for heart emergency is very high. Do you have the money? Do you have anyone to call?" Ezen looked around desperately. She saw the luxury cars parked nearby. She saw the clean, marble floors inside the lobby. She had no money. She had no friends left. She was the nobody now, standing in the rain, begging for a chance to live. She sank to her knees on the cold, wet stone. Her hands were clasped together, shaking as she looked up at the nurses. "I used to be someone," she sobbed, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I am Lolo Ezen Okeke. Please, don't let me die out here in the mud." Suddenly, the sound of a powerful engine filled the air. A sleek, black luxury car pulled up right to the entrance. The headlights cut through the rain like bright swords. The security guards stood up straight, and even the nurses stopped talking. A driver stepped out with a large umbrella, opening the back door with great respect. A woman stepped out of the car. She was tall and stood with perfect posture. She wore a dark blue business suit that fit her perfectly, and her black heels clicked sharply on the wet marble. In one hand, she held a modern smartphone. In the other, she held a sleek car key. She looked like a queen, full of quiet power and success. Ezen squinted through the rain, trying to see the face of the woman who owned this palace of healing. The woman walked slowly toward the entrance, her eyes calm and steady. She stopped just a few feet away from where Ezen was kneeling in the dirt. Ezen's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that face. She recognized those eyes. It was the same girl she had shoved into the mud at midnight. It was the village girl she had called a curse. It was Kachi. Kachi did not scream. She did not laugh. She simply stood there, looking down at the woman who had tried to destroy her. The roles were completely reversed. Kachi was the one in the expensive suit, standing tall under the umbrella, while Ezen was the one crumpled on the ground, soaked and begging. "Kachi," Ezen whispered, her voice full of shock and shame. "Is it really you?" Kachi looked at her mother-in-law for a long moment. She remembered the cold rain of the past, but she also saw the dying woman in front of her. This silent architect had finally met her masterpiece. The girl who was kicked out was now the only person who could open the door. The rain continued to fall, but Kachi did not feel the cold anymore. She stood under her large umbrella, looking down at the woman who had once been her nightmare. Lolo Ezen was shivering on the wet marble, her expensive traditional clothes now gray with mud and soaked with rainwater. Her eyes were wide with a mix of terror and disbelief. "Kachi, please," Ezen gasped, her hand reaching out but not daring to touch Kachi's polished boots. I didn't know it was you who owned all this." Kachi's face remained calm. She remembered the sting of Ezen's palm across her cheek years ago. She remembered the sound of her own voice begging for mercy at midnight. Back then, Ezen had looked at her like she was a piece of dirt under a shoe. Now, that same woman was looking at her like she was a god. "You told me that poverty was a curse that could never be washed away," Kachi said softly. Her voice was steady, cutting through the sound of the rain. "You told me I was a nobody who would die in the streets. Look at where we are now, Mama." Ezen flinched at the word Mama. She bowed her head, her forehead almost touching the wet ground. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. Please, my chest. It hurts so much. Don't let me die out here." Kachi looked at the hospital doors. Through the glass, she could see the doctors and nurses waiting for her command. She held all the power. With one small shake of her head, she could walk away and let the rain finish what Ezen had started years ago. That would be cheap revenge. But Kachi had worked too hard to become a monster like the woman at her feet. She reached into her luxury suit pocket and pulled out a gold pen. A nurse quickly stepped forward with a clipboard, holding the emergency surgery papers. These were the papers that required a deposit Ezen could never afford in 100 lifetimes. Kachi took the pen. Her hand did not shake. This was the same hand that Ezen had slapped. This was the same hand that had scrubbed the Okeke floors and later learned to hold a surgical scalpel. With a quick, smooth motion, Kachi signed her name at the bottom of the page. Take her inside, Kachi commanded the medical team. Give her the best room. Use the newest machines. Save her life. The nurses moved fast. They lifted Ezen onto a soft, white stretcher. As they began to wheel her through the sliding glass doors, Ezen looked back at Kachi. She saw the nobody standing tall against the dark sky, surrounded by the lights of her own empire. Ezen wanted to say thank you, but the shame was too heavy for her tongue. Kachi watched them go. She stood alone in the rain for a moment longer, watching the red lights of the stretcher disappear into the bright, clean hallway of the hospital. She had signed the papers not because she loved Ezen, but because she loved the woman she had become. She had used her success to save the person who tried to destroy her, and in that moment, the last bit of the Midnight Girl was finally free. When Ezen finally opened her eyes, she was not in her small, dusty room. She was lying in bed with sheets, so white and soft they felt like clouds. The air was cool and smelled of clean medicine. Above her, a machine made a steady beep-beep sound, telling her that her heart was still beating. For a moment, she forgot everything. She felt like the powerful Lolo she used to be. Then, the door opened. Kachi walked in. She was no longer wearing her rain-soaked suit. She wore a pristine white doctor's coat over a simple, elegant dress. She held a medical chart in her hand. She didn't look angry, and she didn't look happy. She looked like a professional who had just finished a long day of work. After that, my driver will take you back to your room in the city. You have your life, Ezen. But you must live the rest of it knowing that a nobody was the only one who cared if you lived or died. Kachi walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. Ezen was left alone in the beautiful, silent room. She was alive, but she was broken in a way that medicine could not fix. She had to live with the heavy weight of a debt she could never pay back. The girl she had kicked out at midnight was now the son she had to look at every morning. Kachi had won, not with anger, but with the quiet power of a woman who had turned her mud into gold.